So for question number 1, I thought it was interesting how Esther agreed to marry George, even though she was somewhat reluctant to even right back when they first met. And then I thought it was interesting how Marx was also going to marry someone he hadn't met. So it makes the audience kind of think maybe they would marry each other or be together since they were both in the same situation. And then for question number 2, one value that I found was that the way you presented yourself and how pretty you were was a priority, and this was mainly attached to Esther and George. So George wanted Esther to put on makeup and wear intimate clothing because they were married, and Esther was asked to describe what she looked like in her letter to George, and as if it really mattered what she looked like. So I believe that how you presented yourself and if you were pretty was a pretty big factor. And then for value number 2, marriage was a priority, and it didn't even matter if you were if you actually liked your husband or were happy in your marriage. So this was mainly attached to pretty much all the women. So Esther was pretty quick to agree to marry George, even if she didn't really know him, and was complaining at the very beginning that she wasn't married in her mid-30s. And Mrs. Van Buren never really expressed that she truly loved her husband when Esther asked her. She just kind of dismissed the question. And this suggests that this play sees women as objects that can be controlled, and their opinions weren't really taken into consideration. And at this point in time, women couldn't even really vote because it was 1905. One thing I didn't really understand is I didn't know what a smoking jacket was, and so it was a menswear overgarment that you wear while smoking tobacco, and it was a symbol of wealth and success since it was made from really expensive material like silk or velvet. And so now I understand that the gift that Esther gave to George on their wedding night was actually very special and wasn't cheap to make. And he should have been more appreciative. And so Esther was trying to make George feel special and make him feel like she really truly cared about him. And this is just in this world that status is everything. So if you were seen with a smoking jacket, then you were seen to be rich and successful. I believe that this play reinforces our understanding of the African-American experience during this time period, because even after slavery ended, African-Americans endured decades of segregation with Jim Crow laws, and they were actually seen as less than white people, and even unfortunately sometimes today. And I think this resists stereotypes of African-Americans, because a lot of stereotypes are about how they look and behave, and a lot of times it's unfortunately negative. And this story portrays them, mainly Esther, as respectable, and even though they don't have a ton of money, they are nice people and behave well. And African Americans were used and thought of to serve the wealthy white population during this time period, and even though slavery had ended, the poor African Americans still experienced discrimination. So stereotypes about how they look and behave are more extravagant against African Americans, and the media perpetuates this big time, especially in the news, and keeping an open mind and being accepting can combat these stereotypes. For Mrs. Van Buren was very open-minded and accepting with Esther, and even though that Esther technically worked for her, she was still very kind to her. And so 2 questions that I have is, why do you think Esther was so willing to marry George? And do you think that she was just desperate, or do you think she actually was in love with him? And do you think Marx was secretly in love with Esther? It seemed to me like they had some sort of connection, or do you think it was strictly platonic?